Please, Dad, just leave the uniform in the closet. Nobody needs to see it tonight. That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted, not cruel, just my daughter's voice, quiet and pleading, the night before her engagement dinner, standing in the doorway of the spare room where an old footlocker had sat, mostly closed, for almost 30 years. But we'll get there. 2 weeks after that night, I was standing in a banquet hall reception line, in a suit instead of dress blues, watching my daughter's future father-in-law examine a small velvet box someone had handed him by mistake, a box that had nothing to do with an engagement ring. I remember the exact moment his face changed, the moment he looked up from what he was holding and said, quietly enough that only the people closest to us heard it, "This is a Silver Star citation. Whose name is on this?" And I remember my daughter, standing beside her fiancé, watching her father's whole history rearrange itself in front of a room full of people she'd spent months trying to impress. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Thomas Riley. I'm 72 years old. I live alone in a small house at the edge of a quiet suburb, the same house I raised my daughter Emily in after her mother, my wife Grace, passed away when Emily was only 9. I spent the working years of my life doing maintenance and groundskeeping for the county school district. Steady, unremarkable work that nobody ever asked many questions about, which suited me fine, because the years before that job were not years I discussed easily with anyone, including, for most of her life, my own daughter. I have a garden out back that Grace started before she got sick. Tomatoes and roses she taught me to keep alive out of stubbornness more than any real gift for it. Some mornings, the quiet of that garden is the only company I keep before noon, and I've made a strange kind of peace with that over the years. Here's the thing about me that Emily grew up mostly not understanding, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in a footlocker in our spare room her entire childhood. Before Grace, before groundskeeping, before Emily was born, I served 11 years in the United States Army, including 2 combat deployments in circumstances I still don't discuss easily, even now. During my second deployment, in an ambush that cost 2 men in my unit their lives, I did something that earned me a Silver Star, an action I've never once described in detail to anyone outside a small circle of men who were there with me, because the men we lost that day deserved to be remembered for more than the worst afternoon of both our lives. When I left the service and married Grace, I made a decision, one she supported fully. I didn't want a daughter growing up measuring her father against medals and citations, treating me like some kind of hero when what I mostly felt most days was the ordinary weight of having survived something other men hadn't. I wanted Emily to know me as the man who fixed her bicycle, who showed up to every school play in a folding chair too small for him, who cried without any shame at all at her high school graduation. So the uniform went into a footlocker, the medals went into a small velvet box inside that footlocker, and we simply didn't talk about that part of my life very often. Not from shame. From a wish that Emily's understanding of her father be built on the ordinary, daily proof of love, rather than on old citations she'd never fully understand the weight of. Emily grew up. She went to college, built a career in marketing, and in her late 20s she met a man named Bradley Hensley, whose family I came to understand fairly quickly placed enormous importance on pedigree, the right schools, the right careers, the right kind of family history to display at dinner parties. Bradley's father, David Hensley, had himself served briefly as a young officer decades earlier, a fact the family mentioned often and with considerable pride, framing it as a defining mark of the Hensley family character. From the very first dinner I attended with Emily and Bradley's family, I noticed the careful way Emily's posture changed around them, a kind of eager smallness that had never been part of her growing up, an anxiousness to seem impressive to people who measured impressiveness in very specific terms. "So, Mr. Riley," David Hensley asked that first evening, in the particular tone of a man conducting a polite interview, "what did you do before groundskeeping?" Emily mentioned something about the military briefly. "A while back, yes," I said, "a long time ago now." "Enlisted, I take it. I was an officer myself years ago, different world, that side of things." He said it kindly enough, but the distinction mattered to him, I could tell, in a way it had never mattered to me. "Something like that," I said, and let the conversation move elsewhere because it wasn't the moment at a first dinner to explain 11 years and 2 deployments to a man who'd already decided politely, where I fit in his understanding of things. But dinner number one became months of dinners, and months became the engagement, and every one of those gatherings, I watched Emily grow more careful, more eager to seem impressive by association, at the quiet expense of the parts of her own history she'd apparently decided weren't impressive enough to mention. At the engagement party itself, when Bradley's mother asked about my military background in front of a room full of her friends, Emily answered for me before I could speak. "Dad did some time in the army a long time ago before I was born, really. He doesn't talk about it much." She said it kindly, but with a particular carefulness that made clear she was managing the conversation, steering it away from a subject she'd apparently decided was safer left vague. There was a Christmas gathering, a year before the engagement, where David Hensley told a lengthy, well-rehearsed story about his own brief officer training, describing it as the formative experience that shaped his entire approach to leadership and family. Emily listened attentively, laughed at the right moments, and when David eventually turned to me and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I had any good stories from my own time in, she answered again before I could, saying, "Oh, Dad's stories are pretty low-key, nothing like that," in a tone that closed the subject before it opened. There was an afternoon at a family barbecue, months before the wedding, when Bradley's uncle, a retired police officer with a fondness for military history, asked me directly what unit I'd served with, and Emily physically steered the conversation elsewhere within seconds, mentioning something about the food needing attention. A redirection so smooth I understood, watching it happen, that she'd developed real practice at managing exactly this kind of moment. The night before the formal engagement dinner with both families, the dinner where the Hensleys planned to make a toast honoring both families' proud histories, including David Hensley's own brief officer service, Emily came to find me in the spare room, where I'd been quietly looking through the old footlocker, considering, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate even to myself, whether to wear my old dress uniform jacket, cleaned and pressed instead of a suit. "Dad," she said, standing in the doorway, "please, just leave the uniform in the closet. Nobody needs to see it tonight. It's not that kind of dinner." She said it gently, but there was an edge of genuine anxiety underneath the gentleness, the anxiety of someone terrified of an unpredictable variable at an evening she'd spent months carefully controlling. "I wasn't planning to wear the uniform, Emily," I said, though the truth was I hadn't fully decided yet. "I was just looking through some old things." "It's just David's very particular about that whole subject," she said. "I don't want anything getting complicated. Can you just wear the gray suit?" I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Emily in that moment, not really. I understood, in a way I wished I didn't, exactly what she was protecting, not me, and not her own history, but a version of her family that felt simple and unremarkable enough not to disrupt the very specific story David Hensley had built about pedigree and service, and whose sacrifice counted as impressive. I wore the gray suit. What none of us knew, not Emily, not Bradley, and certainly not David Hensley, was that I had, weeks earlier, been quietly nominated by a veterans organization I'd stayed loosely connected with over the decades to receive a long-overdue formal acknowledgement. The original Silver Star citation paperwork, lost in a records error decades before, had finally been located and processed, and a small velvet box containing my actual medal, along with the original citation, had been mailed to my house just 3 days before the engagement dinner. I hadn't told Emily. I hadn't told anyone. I'd simply set the box, unopened in its outer packaging, on the hallway table, intending to look at it properly once the engagement weekend settled down. I didn't know when I left for the dinner that evening that Emily's cousin, helping tidy the house before guests arrived earlier that day, had found the small package on the hallway table, assumed it was a gift meant for the engagement celebration, and in the chaos of preparation, brought it along to the venue in a bag of last-minute items, where it eventually made its way, through a series of small, well-meaning mistakes, into a box of items being sorted at the gift table. The dinner itself began exactly as Emily had hoped it would. David Hensley gave a toast about the proud histories our families bring together, mentioning his own brief officer service with evident pride, gesturing warmly toward Bradley as a continuation of that legacy. Emily glanced at me once during that toast, a look of relief passing over her face when I said nothing, disrupted nothing, simply raised my glass along with everyone else. Later in the evening, during the informal reception, a waiter trying to help sort through a mislabeled gift table handed David Hensley a small velvet box, assuming it belonged with the other engagement gifts being displayed. David, ever the gracious host, opened it without hesitation, expecting perhaps a pen set or a small keepsake. I want to describe this moment exactly as it happened, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened without me saying a single word. I watched David Hensley's face shift from polite curiosity to something entirely different as he read the small citation card tucked beside the medal. He read it twice, I noticed, his lips moving slightly the second time, and then he looked up, scanning the room, and said loudly enough that conversation nearby quieted on its own, "This is a Silver Star citation. Whose name is on this?" Emily went very still beside me. "That would be mine," I said, and I want to note that I said it quietly, without any performance in it at all, the same tone I might have used to mention I'd left my umbrella at home. "Yours," David repeated, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, not the polite, categorizing look he usually gave me, but something closer to genuine shock. "Thomas, you were awarded a Silver Star." "A long time ago," I said. "For an afternoon I don't particularly enjoy discussing at engagement parties, if I'm honest." "I need to understand this," David said, and I could hear underneath the shock something that sounded almost like embarrassment at his own assumptions. "You said you were enlisted. This citation describes an action that—" He stopped himself, glancing at the card again. "This describes pulling 2 wounded men out of an ambush under direct fire after being wounded yourself. This is one of the most significant citations a soldier can receive." "It happened a long time ago," I said again, because it was, in that moment, the only true thing I had the composure to say. A small crowd had begun to gather near us by then, drawn by the shift in David's voice, and I was aware, in a distant sort of way, of Bradley's mother asking someone quietly what was happening, of a waiter hovering uncertainly with a tray he no longer knew where to set down. "Were you wounded?" David asked, quieter now, some of his earlier performative warmth replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity for the first time all evening. "In the shoulder," I said. "It healed well enough. The 2 men I went back for did not both come home the same way, if I'm honest, though both came home." Emily was looking at me now with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not embarrassment, not the careful management I'd grown used to, but something raw and unguarded. The look of a woman realizing, all at once, in front of a room full of people, that she'd spent months quietly asking her father to make himself smaller for an evening built around exactly the kind of history she'd assumed he didn't have. "Dad," she said very quietly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" "I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters." Something that had been carefully folded away for over 40 years opened its eyes, not with anger, but with a kind of tired, patient clarity, the specific stillness of a man who has spent decades deciding, deliberately, that some stories are better carried quietly than performed loudly. "Because I didn't want you growing up measuring your father against an afternoon that also cost 2 good men their lives," I said, quiet enough that only she and David could hear clearly. "That medal isn't a trophy, Emily. It's a reminder of the worst day of my life. I didn't hide it from you to seem humble. I hid it because I wanted you to know me as your father first, and as whatever that citation says second, if at all." David Hensley, to his credit, set the velvet box down very carefully, as though suddenly aware of its actual weight for the first time. "Thomas," he said, "I owe you an apology. I've spent this entire evening, and honestly this entire courtship between our children, treating my own brief service as some kind of family credential, without ever asking you a single real question about yours." "You don't owe me anything, David," I said. "I didn't correct your assumptions. That's on me as much as anyone." "Why not?" he asked. "Because correcting them would have meant explaining an afternoon I've spent 40 years trying not to relive in detail every time someone asks a polite dinner party question about it," I said. "It was easier to let people assume what they wanted to assume." The reception ended not long after that, quieter than it had begun, with a different kind of attention following me through the room. Not admiration exactly, but a kind of recalibrated respect that felt, if I'm honest, almost as uncomfortable as the years of polite dismissal had been. Emily drove me home that night instead of letting me take a cab, and we sat in her car outside my house for a long while before either of us went inside. "I asked you to hide it," she said finally. "The uniform. I asked you to make yourself smaller tonight, and it turns out I was asking you to hide the most significant thing you've ever done. You didn't know that, I said. You were protecting an evening you'd worked hard on, I understand that. That's not an excuse, she said. I've spent years being embarrassed by a version of your history I invented myself, because I never actually asked you real questions about it. I let David's family's idea of what counts as impressive become my idea too, and I never once stopped to ask what my own father actually went through. Why do you think that happened? I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Because it was easier, she said quietly. Easier to think of you as simple and unremarkable than to imagine you carrying something that heavy. I think some part of me didn't want to know, because knowing would have meant asking harder questions about what you went through, and about why Mom used to get quiet sometimes when your old service came up. That admission cost her something to say, I could tell, and I let it sit between us for a while before responding. Do you remember the men's names? She asked suddenly. The two you saved. Every day, I said. Danny Ochoa and Miguel Reyes. Danny still calls me every year on the anniversary. Miguel's daughter sends me a Christmas card, has for 15 years now. I never told you about either of them because telling you meant explaining the day itself, and I wasn't ready to hand you that weight before you were old enough to carry it, and honestly, I'm still not sure I was ever fully ready. I could have carried some of it, she said. You didn't have to protect me from all of it forever. Maybe not, I said. That's something I've had to sit with these past few weeks too. Protecting you from the weight of it made sense when you were 9. I'm not entirely sure it still made sense once you were 32. Your mother knew everything, I said. She's the only person besides the men I served with who ever heard the full account of that day. She used to say I carried it the way some men carry a scar they've made peace with, not something to hide, but not something to display either. I think she'd have wanted you to know eventually, on your own timeline, not because a mislabeled gift box forced the timeline for us. The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the reception is the climax and everything after is a footnote. But that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Emily asking, over several Sunday dinners, careful, genuine questions about my service, not performative curiosity, but the real, uncomfortable kind that requires sitting with answers that don't resolve neatly. It's David Hensley calling me, awkwardly at first, to ask if I'd be willing to speak with a veterans group his company sponsored, an invitation he extended with considerably more humility than he'd approached our earlier conversations. There was an afternoon, about a month after the engagement dinner, when Emily asked if she could see the full citation, the complete account of that day, not the summary version, but the actual details I'd never shared with her. I told her some of it, enough for her to understand the shape of the day without carrying every detail of it the way I had for 40 years. She cried quietly, not out of drama, but out of a kind of delayed grief for a version of her father's history she'd never made room to properly know. Why didn't Mom ever push you to tell me more? She asked. Because she understood something it took me longer to understand myself, I said. That some things are mine to tell when I'm ready, not simply because someone else decides it's time. Your mother respected that boundary even when I think it frustrated her sometimes. I think she hoped, eventually, the timing would be gentler than this. There was another Sunday a few weeks later, when Emily brought over an old photo she'd found going through some of her mother's things. The two of us, young, at a friend's wedding not long after I'd come home. Grace's hand resting on my forearm in a way that suggested, even in a single photograph, how carefully she'd learned to be present with whatever I was carrying that particular week. She knew exactly how to be around you, Emily said, studying the photo. I never really understood what that meant until now. Your mother had a gift for that, I said. She never once asked me to perform strength I didn't have, and she never once let me disappear into the parts of myself that were hardest to carry either. She held both at the same time, somehow better than I've ever managed to explain. I watched my daughter in those weeks do something I hadn't fully seen her do before. I watched her stop performing for people whose approval had required her to shrink her own family's history down to something more manageable. At the wedding itself, months later, when Bradley's best man made a toast referencing both families' distinguished histories, Emily stood, unprompted, and added her own words. My father served 11 years, including 2 combat deployments, and received the Silver Star for saving 2 men's lives at the cost of his own safety. I spent most of my life not fully understanding that, partly because he protected me from the weight of it, and partly because I let other people's ideas about what counts as impressive keep me from asking real questions about my own family. I'm done doing that. The room was quiet for a moment, and then people began to clap, David Hensley among the first and loudest. Bradley found me afterward near the edge of the reception, looking somewhat sheepish in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "I called you a groundskeeper at the barbecue," he said. "I didn't mean it as small, but I understand now how it must have landed. I'm sorry, Mr. Riley." "You didn't know any better," I said. "Neither did I in a sense for keeping it from you all this time. We're square as far as I'm concerned." "I'd like to actually get to know you," he said. "Not the citation, you, if that's all right." "That's the only version of me I've ever been interested in offering anyone," I said, and I meant it. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that, too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried alone, carefully, for 4 decades. I thought about Grace a great deal in those weeks, what she would have said, watching our daughter finally ask the hard questions neither of us had pushed her toward, watching Emily stand up at her own wedding and mean every word of what she said. I think Grace would have been proudest not of the reception, but of that toast. The reception was an accident. The toast was a choice, made deliberately in front of people who mattered. It's been almost a year now. Emily and Bradley live about 20 minutes from me, and Emily comes by most Sundays, sometimes with Bradley, sometimes alone, and we sit in the garden Grace started and don't always talk about anything important, which is its own kind of gift after a year like that one. Danny Ochoa came to visit last spring, the first time in almost a decade we'd seen each other in person rather than just over the phone, and Emily sat with the two of us on the porch for hours, mostly listening, occasionally asking careful questions neither of us minded answering now that the timing was hers to choose rather than an accident's. David Hensley and I have an odd sort of friendship now, born out of an evening that embarrassed us both in different ways. He asked me, a few months ago, whether I'd consider speaking at a local memorial event, an invitation I accepted carefully, on my own terms, sharing only as much as felt right to share publicly. Last month, Emily was helping me clean out the spare room and found the old footlocker again, still sitting where it always had, and asked if she could go through it properly this time, not out of urgent curiosity, but out of genuine interest in knowing her father more completely. She sat on the floor with the old uniform in her lap for a long time. "Why'd you keep all of this hidden for so long?" she asked. "Not just from David's family, from me." "Because I didn't want you to know your father as a soldier first," I said. "I wanted you to know him as a father. I still do. The soldier survived something terrible. The father was for making sure you never had to carry the weight of that afternoon alongside me." She looked at the old uniform a long moment, then up at me. "You could have been both the whole time," she said. "I just never asked the right questions, and I let other people's ideas about what mattered keep me from wanting to." I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take, or because someone else's definition of impressive has quietly become our own. David Hensley looked at me for months and saw an unremarkable man with an unremarkable history. He wasn't entirely wrong that I preferred an unremarkable life. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Some evenings now, I sit in the garden Grace started and think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent over 40 years being a man very few people fully understood, not because I hid it out of shame, but because I never once thought it needed announcing, and because some of what I carried was never mine alone to share freely. Grace used to say I held that afternoon the way some men hold grief, quietly, respectfully, without needing anyone else's validation of its weight. I think she understood the shape of that quiet better than I ever articulated it myself. I think, too, about how easily a family's understanding of someone can be shaped by an outside measure of what counts as impressive. David Hensley's idea of pedigree, however unintentionally, became the frame Emily used to evaluate her own family's history, simply because she never had reason to question it until an accident forced the question. I don't think that makes her shallow. I think it makes her human, the way most of us are human, inclined to accept the frame we're handed until something disrupts it enough to make us look again, more carefully, at what was there all along. I don't regret the years of keeping that citation folded away in a footlocker. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let my daughter grow up without fully knowing. I'd do it again. Every quiet dinner where I let assumptions stand uncorrected, every year Emily grew up thinking of me as simply her father rather than a decorated soldier, I would trade all of it again for a daughter who loved me first for showing up to her school plays, and only later on her own timeline for whatever that medal represented. That's what a father owes his daughter, the way I see it. Not a legacy to perform, a love that doesn't require an audience. What I do regret, if I'm honest, is not finding a gentler way to tell her myself, before a mislabeled gift box forced the timing at a reception full of strangers. I thought silence was a form of protection, and in many ways it was. But I've learned, watching my daughter finally ask the hard questions and stand up at her own wedding to answer them herself, that some truths deserve a quieter, more deliberate unveiling than the one circumstance handed us that night. Emily mistook my quiet history for an unremarkable one because I let her. I don't blame her for that. I built that impression myself, year by careful year, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. But I'm glad in the end that the truth finally had its say, however accidentally it arrived. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a garden in the evening, once the light goes soft, and the only sound left is whatever the crickets have decided to contribute. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any different for the medal finally being seen, or for David Hensley's newfound respect, or for the applause at Emily's wedding. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in years, not because anyone finally understood the weight of that afternoon, but because my daughter finally understands the shape of her own father a little more completely than she did before, and that understanding didn't require a single word of performance from either of us. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person at your table may be carrying something far heavier than you've ever imagined, and the plainest history is not always the whole story. Don't mistake someone's humility for having nothing significant behind it. And don't wait for an accident to finally ask the people you love the real questions about what they've carried quietly, long before you ever thought to ask. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who's underestimated the quiet ones. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.